Let's go ahead and scroll down to the Trails History Fetch function. And here we have our original query, and we're commenting that out, as well as some of the logic that loops through the results returned from the query. And we've replaced it with a new function called dbQueryRange. This is called a static query because the structure doesn't lend to easy manipulation. So we would do this if we don't expect it to be changed by other modules, and we don't have any conditionals we need to account for in constructing the query. This structure runs faster inside of the backend, so whenever we can use a static query, we should. But it's also reserved only for select statements. So in this statement, when we're grabbing data from the database, it's a perfect opportunity to use a static query. We're using the dbQueryRange function, but we could also use dbQuery. The difference between the two is that dbQueryRange selects a subset of the return values. So if we have a huge table, for example, and we want to grab only 10 values from that table, we can do that using dbQueryRange and setting the initial row that we want to grab and how many rows we want to grab as well. So let's go ahead and look at this structure line by line. First of all, we're using select, so select all, and that's the asterisk there, from Trails History. So you notice maybe two things. One is that this structure is nearly identical to our previous query. And secondly, the difference is that there are brackets, opening and closing brackets around the database table. Now this tells the database API to replace this table name with any prefix table name that exists in the current Drupal installation. The next line here, where UID equals, whereas above we were passing the value directly into the query, in this one we're using a placeholder. Placeholders in queries are delineated with a colon and then a unique name for each placeholder. So at some point in each function that uses a static query, there will be an array that contains the placeholder name and the replacement value name. And then finally we have the order by timestamp descending, which is the same as our previous query. The next parameter that we're passing to dbQueryRange is the initial row that's going to be returned. So that's going to be 0 if we want to start at the beginning of the result set. The next is how many we want to return, and in this case we're taking the number variable, which is passed as a parameter to Trails History Fetch. This way we can tell Trails History Fetch how many items that we want, and we can make that dynamic. And then the final parameter is an array that contains a list of the placeholders as well as the values that will replace those placeholders. Notice that the placeholder still contains the colon. And finally, one more thing to take note of is that the result that's returned from dbQuery or dbQueryRange is an array, so you can use for each to loop through it and perform your logic there, instead of using something like MySQL fetch array to manually fetch each row back. And finally, we're returning the history here.